Well, again, welcome back all. Like I said, I hope you enjoyed that walkthrough time as much as I did. And I have to thank Terrell Thompson, the WheatonArts Special Projects Manager, for producing that slideshow. And now we have Kristen to introduce Skitch. Welcome back. Oh, are you seeing the screen?
Yes, everything looks good.
Good.
Yes,
I just want to double check that we're back on track.
Yes, thank you so much, Marcy. And thank you, Skitch, for taking time out of your day in the studio to come over and share some of your amazing skills with us. Skitch has actually been blowing glass since he was 10. So he has a lot of information to share with us. He's been refining his skills while working in studios throughout the country. He's been drawn to the medium of glass because of its significant history and the technical challenge it presents. And I know from working with him here in our WheatonArts glass studio that he's really great at working with a variety of artists, no matter what the level of familiarity with the medium of glass, to help as a gaffer or lead glassblower in making their visions come true in the medium of glass. He's also worked at John Pomp Studios, a furniture and lighting company in Philadelphia. And he has his own company, Working Man Handmade Glass, that is dedicated to creating well-designed and well-crafted objects that are comfortable and relatable. So a lot of his work is sort of using a more traditional Italian glassmaking technique. But today, he's going to show us a lily pad pitcher. Here's an image of the final product. So he's going to walk us through step by step how this was made, covering a little bit of sort of glass 101 to familiarize those of you who have not been able to get hands-on in the studio and teach us about how this piece was made. Great. Thank you so much, Skitch.
Thank you, Kristen, very much for the introduction. And I'm going to preface this with saying that, we're going to kind of warp speed through the process, but it actually took a little bit longer than the video shows to make this. So I'll cover each little bit of the process one piece at a time. If you have any questions, Kristen will shout them out. Okay. So what we're looking at here is the actual lily pad pictures in the museum. It's kind of a reference point to show the differences in style. You're not really going to see one that looks exactly like this, no matter who you are, because I'm me and the gentlemen that made these are them. So it's going to be completely different than what is in this case. It will have the same applique and the same look, but it's going to be different, showcasing the drip bead, the handle, the lily pad effect itself. I find that the lily pad pitcher is a really good example of an item that would be made in a factory because it shows a lot of quick processes. If you don't mind, Marcy, could you pause it right here? So what we're looking at is a basic set of hand tools. A lot of these hand tools are familiar throughout the world. You would see very similar hand tools as if you went into a factory in Germany, Italy. Any real glass factory would have a very similar set of tools as what you see right here. So I just want to point that out. That's very important. You can go ahead.
Sure.
So this is just a basic layout of the bench setup to show things. I kind of keep a set of tools on the left and the right, depending upon what I need. You'll see me use different tools throughout the process, different shears, tweezers, sculpting tools. These are all the blowpipes and the gathering irons. In order for glass to stick to a pipe, it needs to be preheated. So you will see the ends of them in a small reheating furnace to just basically get it warm enough for the glass to attach to it. Glass will not attach to a room temperature rod until it heats up in the furnace, and then you can get glass on the outside. What we're looking at here is an example of the color. This is the color in the furnace that I made from scratch. This isn't a color that we bought. So I'm going to go into the furnace at this point and gather glass. Gathering glass is very similar to using a honey dipper in a honey jar. You're basically going to wind up glass on the end of a pipe, and therefore you will have a little bit of glass on the end. This will not be the entirety of glass that I use to make this piece. I will have to go in again and get some more glass, but you will see cooling the pipe to make sure that I can, run my hand up the pipe. My version of hot and yours are completely different. So my hands are pretty seasoned. So it might look like I'm just grabbing it, but my hand definition is a lot different than the average person. So I can grab it pretty quickly without having to cool it for a long time. So what we're doing here is we're establishing a nice shape for the glass to blow into. If you blow into a GABA glass that's asymmetrical, you will have an asymmetrical bubble. So what I've done is I've used a wooden block, which is familiar throughout factories and studios across the country, around the world, to help create a symmetrical shape to blow into. And you will see I've blowed into that glass and I've inflated it. It's gotten rounder. So the wall thickness of this bubble is probably, I would say, about a ½ an inch at the most. In order for us to get more glass, we need to let it solidify. If I was to go into the furnace now, when it's this hot, I would lose the symmetry I've created and would have a really hard time creating the shape I want to create. So this time I'm sitting here, I'm not just sitting here to sit here, I'm letting it cool down, keeping it on center, thinking about the process, making sure I have, all my tools that I need. This is kind of the last, point at which you can change anything if you want to make it, a different shape or get another block or something has to happen. So that's why we're kind of hanging out. Once again, going in for a gather. This furnace holds 300 pounds of glass, and there's about 150 to 200 pounds of this transparent green in the furnace. We call it seaweed green. So once again, I've got more glass. We're going to cool the pipe. All the while I'm doing this, we are rotating. It is being kept on center by rotation. So you'll see it move here and there, but if you rotate properly, it actually won't look like it's moving at all. Working back to the bench. Eric is my assistant. He's just handed me the block. Little things like that are very important because it helps streamline the process to allow me to focus on keeping the shape on center. There's really not a whole lot of leeway in an object when you're making it this way. So you have to make sure things are on center from the start. So once again, we're going to shape it with a larger block. I believe Eric is going to blow into the pipe while I'm doing this to help create a more concentric bubble. Once again, using gravity in my favor, I'm holding it down so the glass shrinks up, blowing into the pipe, it's inflating. Okay, now glass cools down as you take it out of the furnace, so we need to constantly reheat it. That reheating chamber is purely used to reheat the glass. So what I'm going to do is reheat the glass, and I'm rolling it across this metal table, which is basically a heat sink. The more I roll it across this table, the more it cools the one spot it's rolling on. So if I roll just the very end and I blow, you will see it will inflate closer to the blowpipe, which will create a rounded shape. So we're actually making the shape of the pitcher right now. Once again, I'm going to reheat it while turning it, thinking about the next step. Okay, now we're going to start to actually stretch out the bubble. We're going to pick up a tool called the jacks. They're referred to as the Swiss Army knife of glass blowing tools. And what this does is allow me to create a constriction and elongate the glass. You'll see I've created a neck with a bulbous shape at the end. So while I'm creating that neck and I'm pulling, I'm creating the top of the pitcher. This constriction I'm creating is where it'll actually break off the blowpipe and will become the top of the pitcher. So Eric is blowing as I'm doing that. So you've seen very small increments of it inflating. I'm using gravity here to stretch it out. As you can see, it's very hot. You would see this. This is the proper way of working glass, which is hot. You're moving through the steps. You're not really letting it get so cold it's not moving. When we do that, it's still well above 1,000 degrees, but it's still, moving around. What Eric is doing right now is he's getting the bit or the applique, which will be the lily pad texture. So what I've done is I've blown out what we call a startup shape or a setup. And while you have a setup, you can transform that into a variety of shapes, a long neck bottle, a pitcher with a short top or a long top. So the bottom rounded section is where the lily pad applique will go. Eric is going to gather this up several times. So Eric is using a solid rod to gather the glass, which is not able to be blown through. And it's basically what we call a gathering iron or a punty rod. So you can see he's gathering quite a bit of glass in order for us to create this lily pad on the bottom. And we're communicating. If you were in the studio, you would hear us talking. I'd be like, okay, I'm ready. He'd be like, are you ready? We're having a dialogue. Okay, so very important step. Can you pause right here, please? Okay, so I'm dropping this glass on the top of this bubble. And what that's doing is that's actually touching the bubble and becoming part of it. So the texture that we're creating, if you were to look at a lily pad picture, it would be almost seamless. You would see obviously the differences in thickness, but this section of dropping this glass on the top of this will be blown and melted in so that it becomes like one homogeneous piece. So I'm dropping this on the top of the bubble, cutting it off, and then I'm going to take a reheat and sculpt it. And it happens very quickly, so please pay attention to make sure you don't miss the actual sculpting of the lily pad part, because it happens very, very quickly. Okay, you can resume. So I've dropped it on, I'm cutting it off. So all the while I'm turning, keeping it on center. Now we go for the reheat. Now remember, the body has solidified pretty well. You know, it's still around 1400 degrees, but the bit I just put on is very hot. It's moving. So I'm going to take a very specific pair of tweezers. I'm going to grab and create the lily pad texture right here. So those tendrils, or, you know, whatever you want to call them, really, they become so melted in that it's basically a difference in thickness. It's not so much a texture on the surface. It is there, you can feel it, but it's actually blown and melted in. You'll see I'll blow it and the heat will saturate and cause the two pieces to become one. So we're reheating here. I'm turning very slow to saturate the piece as much as possible. If you overheat, you can lose all the texture that you've created, but also you can create a shape. I can't really touch this to create a uniformed, you know, bottom to this picture. So I have to make sure everything's on center, and I'm really trusting the setup. So I'm holding it up to shorten it up. You'll see it's very hot. Turning slow, keeping it on center. So what I'm going to do here is use my tool, which is metal. It's called a tagliole, and it's used to take heat out of the piece. So I'm basically touching it very lightly, allowing it to suck heat out of the bottom. Eric is blowing, and you'll see it's melting in. It's becoming one piece. And he's not having to blow very hard. It wants to inflate. So there's the symmetry. Basically, the bottom third, I would say, of the picture is done at this point. So what Eric is doing now is he's getting the foot ready. The foot is a much more controlled, concentric application. There's not a whole lot of room for error, so the center of my object and the center of his bit have to match very well. So Eric is using gravity as well to make sure things are straight and round. So I'm going to take what's called a flash here. Flash is just a maintenance heat. It's used to make sure the piece stays above 1,000 degrees. When glass drops below 1,000 degrees, it has a tendency to release its stress, which is caused, you know, by differences in temperature. It's not necessarily the whole piece is too cold. It's that the piece is not an even temperature. So you'll see I'm torching it here because the neck is much colder than the bottom. Glass emanates light when it gets above a certain temperature. So that's why the bottom is glowing orange and the top is a dark, dark green. So I constantly have to maintain this temperature. So here we're just waiting again to make sure, you know, everything's on center. Eric is gathering up the last of his foot. He's going to come over, same as before. We're going to go straight up and down, and we're going to take it right off the top. So I'm going to line up the roundness of his bit to the roundness of the bottom of my object. I'm going to turn, make sure it's on center. I'm taking my time here. Okay, so now we're back where we were. We're taking an overall flash, and now we're going to heat the bottom of this object. So this is a very good example. You can add a foot to a lot of objects. You'll see tomorrow I add a foot to the plate that I've made, but adding a foot, creates a stable foundation for you to build off of. So if you're making something that's low and wide, you'll see often feet applied. But, the beauty of this process right now is that we're using the furnace glass to its maximum ability. We're able to create all these different decorations with just one color. So a lot of factories would have that happen, where you'd have furnaces full of color and they would be applying those bits in different fashions to create different textures, feet, handles, lip wraps, different applique. So what we're doing here is we're creating the foot, the shape of the foot, the contour of the foot. As we paddle and create pressure from both sides, you create a uniform kind of wafer. So as he's applying pressure and I'm applying pressure, we're creating this foot. And you can see from this shot, the contour is like a little conical. And the foot is very much hotter than everything else. Taking some time to adjust my tool bench. I have a bit of an OCD flair, so everything that I kind of do is very methodical. I like my tools in a very specific place. I have a tendency to double check, triple check things before we start the day. Okay, can you pause right here, please? This is a very important thing to notate. This is called a punty or a transfer. Now, this is when two people have to work, in harmony to the point where things are on center. And center is relative because we're not really working on an axis that we can create center. So when I put that punty rod on the center or the bottom of that object, I have adjustability. I do have a margin, but if it's off center, it acts like a cam and causes things to move off center. So no matter what, even if the piece is straight and my punty is off center, what's going to happen is the piece is then going to start to move like this, and I will never have a straight point to operate off of again. So this scenario where we're putting it on and adjusting it has a very, very short time frame. But what you'll see is I adjust it, and when I knock it off of the pipe and Eric takes the piece over to the reheating chamber, it's moving. I want that to move so I can adjust it based on feel and my eye to keep it straight. And honestly, the best glass makers in the world, straight is relative. Straight is straight to the bottom of the object. So if I punty it off center by mistake, I have to maintain the top and the bottom of the piece being in the same orientation. Okay, you can go ahead. Okay, so now we're turning. You'll see I push the rod up and down. It's a very slight thing. I can feel it. I can see it. I'm communicating with Eric, are you okay? Does it feel too hot? What's going on? He's moving it like that to make sure that it doesn't have too much play in it. A little bit of water on top to create a stress point and breaking it off. Now it's moving and we want that to move. We don't want it to be a rigid mass. And you'll see the more it's moving, the more I can straighten it. Very important technique. So now I'm really just focusing on the top half of this object. The bottom of it is pretty much there. I would say the foot, the lily pad section, and the bottom third of the spherical part are done. So now we're going to work on the top, which has just as much work to do as the bottom. We have to put a drip bead on and a handle. So what I'm going to do here is I believe I'm going to trim this, which means I'm going to cut off a little bit of excess material. I did 2 of these pictures that day just to make sure I had the process down. I trimmed one and I didn't trim the other because the break off can be really nice, which you can avoid trimming, which is great because it's another step in the process you can move through. So yes, I'm going to trim this. So what I'm going to do is take the tweezers and I'm going to stretch out the top of the vessel, creating a thinner lip. And then I'm going to take my shears and I'm going to cut. Now, this is like rubbing your head, patting your stomach, and running down the street at the same time. Because when you cut the top of this and you're turning, you're applying force from 2 different directions. And you have to make sure that your pressure while turning equals your pressure while cutting, while everything is straight and it's not going to fall off the rod. Okay, so now we're reheating the top. Eric is getting the drip bead going. So he's gathering this simultaneously while I'm making this object. So basically what's happening right now is I'm going to take a heat and I'm going to make sure everything is solidified and straight. And Eric has the rod in his hand and he's waiting for me to tell him to go. He's waiting for me to say, okay. And it might just be a nod of the head. It might be me actually physically saying, okay. It might just be me even looking at him. Because honestly, a lot of times I don't really communicate that much. So I just said, okay. I just said, go ahead. So he's going to go ahead. He's going to come over. Glass going straight up and down. Gravity, perfect example of gravity right here. Straight up and down. I rip it to the floor. I cut it. The glass is fluid. It wants to stick to hot glass. It sticks. I rotate. 1, 2, 3, sometimes 4, and I rip it away. You'll see it's called casting off. Casting off is when the glass is disconnected from the object because it's so hot, it literally just wants to peel away. So that drip bead is melted in. It's not melted in so it's smooth, but it's melted in so it's not going to break off. And I've just created the actual spout of the pitcher simultaneously. It's very, graceful, sudden movement that has to happen. You can't just stop and put the spout in. You have to do it while you're opening the rest of the vessel. So it's a nice fluid form. It's not just like, moving up the form. So what Eric is doing now is getting the handle. And while he's getting the handle, I have to maintain a constant visual straightness of the piece, because the handle is the very last thing that happens. After the handle's put on, it's not really able to be changed form-wise. So once the handle's put on, and then it's done. If it doesn't look good, you move through it. Moving through the process is very important. If we were working in a factory setting, you would have somebody waiting for you to be done with another pitcher, which means you can't sit there and wait. You have to move through the process. So if it's not working out, one, you need to fix it quickly, or two, you need to not be in that position where somebody's waiting for you, because you're holding up the entire factory. The mentality of a factory is you have a hierarchy, the maestro or the head or the gaffer. Gaffer means grandfather in some factories. So the idea of being a grandfather means you're the highest up on the food chain. So when I do something like this, handles, applique, it's more of an advanced technique. You wouldn't see this in every fashion. So what Eric's done is he's shaped the handle to just a cylinder. We're going to go straight up and down. We're going to touch it down. Now, I'm doing a mental check of where the opposite side of the spout is to make sure I'm in line. It's a visual cue. I can't mark it because I can't see where that mark would be while I'm putting this handle on. So I count in my head to 3, and that's exactly where the spout is. It's a third from where I started. Grab the handle, go back, I touch it, and I turn. When I touch down and I turn, centrifugal force takes over and spins out the handle, so it creates a contour. You'll see I'm moving it around what seems to be violently, but I'm actually using gravity and centrifugal force to shape this handle so it has a fluid shape to it. I'm using a piece of graphite here to shape the handle and to make sure it's straight. I only have a very small margin of error to make sure that it's straight and strong and solidified, and I'm just using some heat to fire polish the cut mark. We're reintroducing some heat into that connection. As you can see, we have a pretty good profile here. Now it does seem quite dark, but as you'll see in the picture before and after, it has quite a bit of transparency to it. So in order to take a piece off the rod, you apply some stress to a point, and a stress means cooling. So water cools the object between the rod and the connection, and then when you tap it, it breaks off there. So now we're going to walk over to an annealing oven. We're going to put this piece into an oven, which allows it to cool at a very, very slow rate to help release the stress evenly. So the one thing I'll say about annealing, which is, I would say, it's more than 50% of the process of making an object. You could be the world's best glassmaker, but if you don't know the dynamics of your piece and the chemistry, so to speak, you can't really anneal the piece properly, which would cause a lot of issues down the road, things falling apart, possible issues with the piece itself not being, stable. Obviously, a lot of people reference the Corning telescope lens, which the Corning telescope lens took about 7 years to perfect, and it would anneal for 2 years. And after the annealing process, it still broke numerous times. And you have to think about something that creates so much energy to produce. There's a team of people doing that. So I could have made 30 pictures that day, and if I don't anneal them properly, they will not come out. And then we have wasted the entire day doing that, not to mention the setup guy's time. A couple things I'll touch on within the process that I didn't really have time to, but I will now, is the idea of working in a factory is based on timing and technique. So this piece, from my opinion, is the perfect example of a factory object, because you're utilizing the furnace, you're utilizing your assistant, you're utilizing the hot colors that you have. So, this is something that you would be able to do rather quickly and produce a lot of. I wouldn't, be making pictures that have like dolphins all over the handle and a million applique, because the startup guy is going to just make the basic shape, and then he's going to be waiting for me to put on all this stuff. So you can see everything happened relatively quickly. And there was some editing to move it along, but honestly, Eric and I, when we were doing this piece, it only really took about 15 to 20 minutes to really do it. We did 2 of them that day, so we would have the process down, but it's all relatively simple. Once your bubble's on center, things really go smoothly. So I was really happy with it, and I'm glad I could share it with you guys.
Yes, that was great, Skitch. Barbara has an excellent question about what fuel is used in our furnace. And so can you talk a little bit about also our furnaces in general,
Sure.
and a little bit behind what's going on in that glowing hole back there?
Okay, so a furnace itself is a giant insulated box, and there's two different types of furnaces. What we have right behind the picture here is called a freestanding pot furnace or a crucible furnace, which has what I like to say is a giant ceramic cereal bowl on the inside. This one holds about 300 pounds of glass, which seems like a lot. It would seem like a lot of glass to most people, but in the average day, I've used way more than 300 pounds. And that's not just making one 300-pound piece, that's making a lot of smaller pieces that equal several pounds. We have three furnaces total in the studio. This one behind the picture is the smallest. Then we have two other furnaces, one that holds 2,200 pounds of glass and the other one that holds 1,200 pounds of glass. Now, when you have multiple teams of people working, you can go through quite a bit of glass. So we need to have a variety of sizes. You wouldn't just have one 5,000-pound furnace, because if somebody's making a casting and the temperature of the glass needs to be different, then you can't really blow out of that. So the larger furnaces are what are called day tanks, and they are made using fused cast bricks. It's like a giant log cabin. When you put the bricks together properly, you create a very tight constructed box. And it's kind of hard without a visual, but imagine when you go to the store and you buy one of those inflatable swimming pools. The reason why it holds its shape is because you fill it with water. So when you fill the furnace with glass, the compression of the glass pushes against all the bricks and allows it to stay together. The only downside to that is when the furnace is done its life, which is about 7 to 10 years, you need to fully dismantle the furnace and then build a new one from the ground up. The freestanding pot furnace, which we have behind the picture, is a freestanding pot. So it's a pot sitting in a giant fireplace, so to speak. And that allows you to take the pot out when it's broken, put a new one in, and you can get back to blowing glass in a relatively short period of time. They're all fueled with natural gas. This furnace behind the picture is 1,000,000 BTUs, which sounds like a lot, but it's so insulated that it actually runs at about 26% of its capability. So in its highest form, whenever I turn it up, it's running at 100. But when it sits and gets the temperature and idles, we call it, which means it's just sitting there, it runs at 26%. And the burners are like a jet engine. It's basically when you blow into a campfire, it gets bigger. So the flame has a lot of air pressure behind it, which causes the flame to get bigger and hotter and allows you to heat the chamber very, very quickly and very, very hot. The materials that make the furnace are meant to get that hot. So they are working together to insulate and turn that heat into a substantial amount of energy. The last thing I'll say is there's two different kinds of material that make a furnace. There's reflective and refractive material. Reflective material bounces the heat off of it and allows it to get really hot, but it doesn't hold the heat. Refractive material holds the heat and then reflects it back into the chamber. So there's a combination of those two materials to make our furnaces. Very good question. Thank you very much.
And again, once you turn a furnace on to melt the batch in there, you have to keep it on 24/7, right? So this is we're
Correct.
constantly heating to
Correct.
maintain that temperature.
Furnaces
Um,
stay on anywhere between 6 months to 7 years.
That's amazing. So we've got some more excellent question about color, in
Great.
terms of how do you get different colors? How I know you've been making your own color, so I'd love to hear a little more about that process. And then how does that affect your furnace in terms of you've got this green in there? How do you change that color within the furnaces?
Okay, so the glass is extremely corrosive when it's hot. The number one reason why most furnaces need to be replaced is because the constant effort of charging or filling the furnace is detrimental to the furnace itself. So when the glass is above about 2,000 degrees, it becomes aggressive and eats away at the liner. So when we melt a color, it's a transitional process. We always start with clear. The surface of a brand new furnace is very susceptible to pitting and contamination. So as soon as you get clear glass in there, it becomes protected. So this color specific, we call it seaweed green, is a formulation of several different chemical compounds, but the base glass model, it's relative. And I say this in all the narrations that I do. Beach sand does not make glass. Beach sand is a small component because it has silica sand in it. But there's rocks, there's wood, there's metal, there's a lot of foreign bodies in there. So pure silica sand melts at about 3250, which is very close to what borosilicate is. But pure silica is not an efficient way to make glass. We flux it down with lime and potassium and different types of chemicals that lower the melting temperature. So average clear glass melts anywhere between 23 and 2400 degrees. The hotter you melt it, the shorter it takes to get to that clear, clean state. Melting glass, as I reference in my bio, and I'm sure you can read it at some point again, glass making is a lifestyle. So the idea of making glass and then making an object out of the glass is basically full conception. You can take the glass you've made and make the object that you want. So I've spent a lot of time making glass from scratch. You can buy cullets and pre-made glasses, but I like to try to go full circle. So I've made a variety of colors for Wheaton and myself. And the idea of making that color, the basis is, the most relatable color is cobalt. Cobalt glass takes cobalt oxide. So about 5 grams of cobalt oxide will tint 1,000 pounds of glass almost black. So it's a very small amount of certain chemicals, but it's never just one. Like it's cobalt in conjunction with silica sand, soda ash, potash, lime, antimony. I could rattle off the whole periodic table to make one formula, but the idea of creating consistent formulas is really important. Now, I have to say, I'm fortunate enough to work here where we have this ability to make a color, but generically, a lot of studio artists will buy their color, which will come in a bar or frit form, which is like fish tank gravel, and that can be used to make 30 pumpkins or 10 vases. So a lot of studios will melt one furnace full of glass, which is clear, and then they will add colors individually per person's needs. They won't necessarily melt an entire furnace full of color. So, the short answer, which I just gave a really long one, but the short answer is that making color is a very unique process. A lot of factories would have what's called a batch master or a colorist, and they would literally, that's all they would do is formulate and make colors and track it. And it's a very, very common technique to learn when you're doing the Venetian or the Italian style of glass blowing. And when I talk about that tomorrow, I'll go a little bit more to the specifics of color because I've made some specific colors for that.
So when you mentioned you add that sort of oxide to the batch to change the color, does that change how the glass feels as you're making something, or how the melting temperature is? And
so the longevity, the working life of the glass and the heat characteristics all come from a couple of things. How far down the food chain you go. If you buy cullet, which is already melted glass, kind of looks like chunks of broken ice or broken glass, that's kind of the middle ground. You won't have a lot of elasticity at that point because you'll have lost the beginning characteristics of the glass. So if you melt what's called batch or silica sand itself, you will have the rawest, purest form. It's like so free flowing, it has no expulsion of its chemical base. So when I add a color to it, or when I add a chemical compound to it, for instance, like that green, seaweed green has chrome in it, potassium dichromate, and red iron oxide. And the chrome is a very, very heavy metal, which, in conjunction to how much glass it is, it has a tendency to hold its heat because it's a heavy metal that doesn't expel heat very quickly. So that glass is what we call runny, or has a very long working life. But there's other colors that I've made, like oranges, reds, yellows, some whites, which are very stiff and can be designed to be stiff so that they work in your favor to create specific techniques. And the idea of creating and formulating colors based on techniques is a very tried and true way to create a certain design. And tomorrow, when I show the reticello, you will have a really good understanding of why having specific colors works well.
Yeah, Mary had mentioned white
Right.
cane being used often in some of that Renaissance Italian
Right. So the
where,
idea, and I don't want to go into it too much, obviously we'll talk about it tomorrow,
yeah.
but the idea of having a color that is stiff goes back to certain factories being proprietary to their ability to make a color with that characteristic. So a lot of the recipes and colors that I have were passed down to me or generated in conjunction with other maestros and color makers all over the country and the world that are like they have their own color catalog, so to speak. And when you change the chemical structure of the color, it's like it's not going to create the same look as it would from a manufactured color. There's going to be characteristics there. And a lot of the people that I've worked with have a tendency to use the same color scheme for their work for years. And that's indicative of them.
Mhm. Okay, now we've got some questions about your tools.
Okay.
So one thing is where do the names of some of these tools come from? I know, like, you know, some of them have an Italian name, some of them have you know, more English sounding names.
Right.
Can you talk a little about the origins of the tools and how you identify them?
Okay. So this is a very complicated question because I'll start it by saying this is that glassmaking in the United States is a relatively new uh, aspect in the studio sense, meaning you guys being able to come in and blow glass, and it's not just a factory setting. So the tool itself and its name, a lot of the names that I reference are pretty much Italian or Venetian because the basis of my knowledge started in the Italian and Venetian style. But when you go to a factory in any other country, in any other part of the world, and you say, "Can I have a pair of jacks?" they're going to know what it means because the familiarity of that term is so entranced in how we talk about glass that they'll be like, "Oh, well, this is what you call it, but this is what we call it." The shears, they have specific names. You have a diamond shear, you have a straight shear, trimming shears, all of these different names, they kind of derive from the actual thing the tool does. The only one that really doesn't have a specific reference point, the Jax itself. Now, I've seen it spelled Jax and I've seen it spelled Jack. But from what I understand, the Jack is like when you're playing a game of jacks back in the day, the tips of the tool look like the little stars you throw on the ground and pick up with a ball. But can I be honest with you? Like, I've worked in a million factories and with a lot of people, and everybody calls them the jacks. Now, I don't know if that's just like somebody decided to call it a jack and it was like, oh, it's a jack, because a lot of things date back to specific times in history and their influence on what was being made at that time. Once again, the reticello will reference that very, very importantly. So I'll go over that specifically, but that's kind of where the tool names come from. And it's a very generic name. It's just like a shear or a tweezer. You know, a tag is like a spatula. Some people call it a spatula. Some people call it the tag. Some people call it the metal thing. So it's all kind of very specific.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can share my screen here because someone has a blast from the past for you.
Oh boy.
Speaking of tools, can you see that?
Oh, I know who this is.
Right. So, do you still use this really lovely case here that's
Yeah.
got all the foam cutouts? I mean, this, as a museum person who does collections management, this is beautiful.
So the history behind this case was that this, I'm sorry I'm getting so close, but I'm just looking at the background. This this photo was taken when I was in college. And this was the
Nice.
tool case that I had made to transport my tools back and forth from college to Pennsylvania. And this, I wish I might be able to do it for tomorrow if we have time, but I'll lay out all my tools and show you a brief picture of what they are. But it's about, I would say, 10 to 15 times this now. And the
Wow.
reason why it's so big is because some tools are very specific to the process of what you're doing. So sometimes you need something that's large, something that's small, something that is, a certain cutting capacity. So that, I mean, that picture, I was just ironically enough talking about that thing yesterday with another person I was working with. It was so funny, but I'm glad that that came up. That's pretty amazing. I still have the case, but it's too small for all the tools that I have.
Yeah, that actually, we have an exhibit in the museum right now about the 50th anniversary, and it was really interesting to me looking through a lot of the work that was made here in the studio by the artists, many of which you assisted with, and how many reference tools and hands,
Yeah.
and the fact that part of this glass experience is again making something with your hands and with your tools. And Alex mentioned practice and how that's a really important part of
I have to
what you
say,
do.
one of the biggest tools, if we go down this road of working with glass, is the unwillingness to fail and try to make it good. If you are never really open to learning about how things are going to happen, like the lily pad pitcher has a lot of history, and I'm only 36 years old, and I've seen a lot of historical reference points in glass. And the lily pad pitcher itself, you know, the way I make it and the way you've seen it made, other places might not be exactly the same, but understanding the basic process and the willingness to try to figure it out is really what's important. And the biggest tool is the physical mind and the hand, and putting those two things together to like work through the process. And that's really important. Like for me personally, making glass is the epitome of process, because everything is related to the next step: how you treat yourself, what your mindset is, uh, who you work with, where you work. It's all deriving, what you want to make. And oftentimes glass studios and factories were the most beautiful of buildings. They had the most natural light. It was so full of energy. It's not just like this hole in the wall that you blow glass in. It is a epicenter of creativity and process. And I think you can always find a piece of glass and trace it back to its origin. And there's so much rich history in that spot. It wasn't just like a glass factory. It happened upon because of so many different things. And just like that tool case, the history of my career and my process has had so many high and low points that you basically learn from those and become better and better and better. And you just wind up striving for excellence in making when you become that kind of craftsperson.
Yeah. We have another really good question. We saw in the video, we saw Eric, who's currently your assistant. I know right now, due to COVID, we have to have a narrow, just one assistant over there. So it's great that Eric's joined us. So could you talk a little bit about, working with an assistant, whether it's Eric specifically or in general, and how you learn to work together? And you mentioned, you have these sort of signals that you give, you know, how do you develop that connection with your assistant, and how important is it that you're able to work with someone you can trust, to help you make your piece?
So I I follow uh, a very stringent line when it comes to working with people. I choose hard to not work with a lot of different people in the assistant aspect, because the idea of getting in the groove and us working together is very important. So the more I can work with one person, the more I can understand what I'm going to get, how I'm going to get it, what I need. There's not a lot of dialogue. There's not a lot of worry. There's not a lot of nervousness. Eric has a small history in working here at WheatonArts in our studio, and also working with me. And his idea of wanting to learn actually drives his ability to be a good assistant. Um, Generally, assisting and gaffing, which is what I was doing, are two completely different things. Just because you're a great gaffer doesn't mean you're going to be a great assistant. So having this dialogue and this camaraderie and this understanding of how to work together is really, really the baseline for making anything. And just like a sports team, You're only as good as your lowest player. So I could be the best glassmaker in the world, but when I work with somebody who has a small skill set, I need to be understanding of how to describe things to him, of how to reference things to him. I could be like, yeah, you know, go get the bit. And he's going to know that that bit is for this thing, because a bit is a generalized term. So over and over, you'll see us reference the same talking points. But a lot of times what I do, and I did this in the pitcher and in the reticello and in the apples we're making and in the pumpkins, is in the beginning of the day, we have a powwow. We talk about what we made the day before. We talk about what we're making now. And we also talk about where we had problems, because if he's having a problem or I'm having a problem, we discuss it beforehand, because we'll get in the zone and we'll just go for hours and we won't even be talking about what we're doing because we're so harmonized. And if we'll say, hey, you know, oh, this thing's burning up, or oh, this is getting weird, I'll say, okay, let's stop, take a look at it and see. And just as, you know, I said before about the lifestyle and the characteristics of working glass and perfecting things, in order for two people to work together, you guys need to be on the same page about what you want, because this is not a job. This is a lifestyle. Glassmakers lived in towns together. They were often family represented. So the idea of Eric and I working together means that we need to respect each other. We need to be on the same page, and we need to be honest. So I'll say, Eric, you know, we're going to do this thing. You know, how do you feel about doing it? He's like, oh, okay. Or, oh, I've never done that before. So we stop, we look at the process and we figure it out. And then we move forward. That builds confidence, that builds camaraderie, and that builds a connection that allows us to trust each other. So when I say, Eric, go get me a punny, he knows what I want. And if he doesn't, he'll ask. And I'm not going to shame him, or I'm not going to say, oh man, what's going on? I'm going to say, okay, let's do it this way. Or, okay, before the next one, I'll show you how to do that. There's a lot of that happening. Even with the assistants I've had for 4, 5, 6 years straight, we still have a dialogue about making stuff. Okay, you know, bring it a little hotter. Don't bring it so hot. Are you ready? Are you not ready? You know, so on and so forth. And often a lot of the great, great glass makers and factories have had the same lineage and family and people working there for tens of years, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And that really makes a good, stable foundation for making glass.
So do you find that relationship with the assistant, or, you know, oftentimes there'd be a team of people even when you're making more complex objects? Because you've worked both in a factory setting, and then here at Wheaton, you're doing a lot of atelier work almost for artists that might have something that has never been made before in glass, or at least not that we know of. So could you talk a little bit about how as a team and you work together on how to either perfect that production and the similarities and differences with then when you're coming up with something that's totally new?
Sure. So the baseline is, and Krista made a really good point, making work for non-glass artists is by far the most difficult thing to do. Whenever anybody asks me the hardest thing I've ever made, it's working with somebody who has no expectation of what glass can do. And that's exciting. For me, it gets me really excited, because it gives you the opportunity to work with an artist, designer, fabricator, architect that has a limitless mindset. So first thing you need to do is you need to be honest with them. And you can say, hey, this is not going to work. Or you can say, hey, this is attainable, but in reality, you want it to be like this, and it's really going to be like this. So being honest and being a leader in a team is very important. So as Kristen referenced, I have worked with teams of people, 10, 12, 5, 2. I often work with 2 other people. So it's me and what I call the main assistant, and then a secondary assistant. And those people have a understanding of what their responsibilities are. But when we're working with an artist who's not a glass maker, who either is in our emanation program that we have here, or is somebody that's hired the studio to make something for them, there needs to be a leader, somebody that directs and follows the guideline. Because if you don't lead properly, it's all downhill. I'm being honest with you 100%. There's no expectation that's worse than having an expectation. Because when I work with people on a brand new idea, I say to them, we could spend the next week making nothing and throwing everything out, because we're figuring it out. And what that does is it sets them up for reality. And my mother always told me, the best thing is to have no expectation, because then you'll never get let down. Right. So when you work on a new idea with an artist, an assistant, a team of people, assume that the first couple are no good. That's why I made 2 pictures instead of 1.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, another good question about these, the communication, since I know the video we had was silent, so you could narrate over it, but I know the hot shop often has a lot of noise with the furnaces and different tools and stuff. Do you use a lot of nonverbal signals in the hot shop?
It depends. I'm pretty vocal, so to speak. So I can get my point across. I'm not yelling, but I have an inside and an outside voice. But oftentimes there's like a head nod, or the thing I do a lot is I just say okay. Like I'll say okay when I'm ready. I'll say okay when I want somebody to bring me something. Um, Oftentimes I wish I could have a camera on my shoulder. Oftentimes Eric or whoever is waiting for me, and they're like, okay, what's the next step? And I'll, it'll be the punty, and I'll be like, okay, or we'll make the handle. Okay. It's just like, he's like, we're at the next point in the process, and I'll say,
Mhm.
okay. If you get far enough down the line, the best example I can recommend is pumpkins. I don't say anything. I just go. And then when I stop, we're done. And
Mhm.
there's really not a whole lot of communication other than, okay, the oven's getting full. Okay, we're running out of glass. Okay, we need more pipes up. So that is like a very like straightforward. There's not a whole lot of chit chat like, hey, oh, this looks really nice. Oh, it's more like, okay, move up, boom, boom, boom. So that's a very common way of communicating.
Yeah, I know I was at actually it was at a glass conference in Corning, and Mary Mills, our previous speaker, had a little get together, and I got to meet some glass blowers from RIT who were deaf.
Yes.
And so it was really interesting talking to them again. So they are using all nonverbal cues, but like you said, when you get to a point that you know what's happening in the studio and
Sure.
you can read what the gaffer or the leader is doing, you don't necessarily need as much of that vocalization, because you
Right.
just you kind of know, okay, they need me to blow this so that we can
Right.
get that bubble going or whatnot. So
So, ironically enough, when I started blowing glass at a very young age, I went to a school in Philadelphia, and part of our learning process was we brought in the Pennsylvania School for the Deaf, and 2
nice.
days a week we went to school with them, and then 2 days a week they went to school with us. So
Nice.
they learned how to blow glass, and I taught them how to blow glass, and we had a dialogue that was very good. And I'm very rusty on my ASL, but I have to tell you, we had a dialogue that is stronger than some dialogues I have with people now. And that idea of working with somebody that is hearing impaired, or has a disability, glass is actually the perfect platform because it creates a uniform language that
Mhm.
everybody understands, which is the material's goal is to get it to X. So if we can all wrap our heads around how to get this material to be this shape, then we can get there, no matter if you can speak, talk, walk, or whatever. I've seen anybody and everybody make glass throughout my career. I mean, I really think it's a limitless material when everybody's in the same space.
Absolutely. That's awesome. Well, we're just about out of time here. So one last question for those who aren't as used to hanging out with glass blowers. Why are you wearing sunglasses?
Okay. I The very short answer, because we're running out of time, is um,
You
glass
got about
blowing
5 minutes.
light. Glass blowing light is a different type of wavelength than the sun. So if I wear regular glasses, it's not harmful, but the tinted lens that I have actually filters out the wavelength of light produced by the reheating chamber. And the glasses are very expensive. And I just actually got a new pair because the other pair I had was 7 years old. And I wear prescription glasses also. You cannot wear contacts when you blow glass because your eyes will dry out and the contacts will glue to the front of your eyeball. So the idea of wearing glasses is for 2 things. One, safety glasses are required in the glass blowing studio. 2, the tinted lens helps me see things better. So in combination with all of those factors, these are about $1,800 glasses. And I have 2 pairs, one pair for the next time I need them, and this pair for now. And I wear them all the time because I can't see without them. And in order for me to do this all the time, I have to have these glasses. So it was an investment. I never wear clear glasses. I blow glass well over 40 hours a week. So I oftentimes have them on all the time. And I'm just used to it. And honestly, I never really tell that I'm wearing them. Sometimes I take them off to like think, or I just take them off to look at something really close because like I can't really see when, like stuff like this. But I am always wearing them. You will, almost every picture of me has them on.
Absolutely. And it's a good investment. Save your eyes for the future.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Skitch, for taking time out of your day
No
to
problem.
come over here and talk to us about glass and how you make it, and walking us through that lily pad. And for everybody, tomorrow at this time, Skitch is going to be back with us, and he's going to show us the reticello technique, and that's going to be really awesome. I've seen him. I've been lucky enough to see him do it before, and so it's a really amazing technique. So I'm really excited to share that with you all tomorrow. So thank you again, Skitch. Really, really appreciate it. And good luck with your apples.
Thank you very much, guys. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to talking to you tomorrow.
Thank you, Skitch. And thank you for
bye-bye.
taking yourself away. And it was nice to see your eyes.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you so much.